So in this video, which is continuing our discussion about making sure you select an iOS software image that will fit your needs within GNS3, the next thing we're going to talk about is memory considerations. Now, what do I mean by that? Cisco iOS software, just like anything else that you download, whether it be another web browser or an email client or an instant messaging program, they all take up memory within your laptop. And I'm presuming you're using some sort of laptop or possibly a server to run GNS3. And the memory that you have available on your laptop is a constrained resource, right? You only have so much of it to go around. And this is something to think about when selecting a Cisco iOS software image for two reasons. Number one, we want to make sure if we have a choice, once again, you might not have a choice, but if you have a choice among different images that you can use, if one image requires significantly larger memory to run than another image, it might be in your best interest to select that other image that requires less memory. For number one, for your laptop, right? It's going to save memory in your laptop. The more routers that you have open and running, the more memory it's going to chew up on your laptop, the more resources it's going to consume. Another thing about memory considerations is when you actually go to import the software image into GNS3 itself. Part of adding a new software image to GNS3, telling GNS3, this is what I want to use, part of that process is GNS3 will ask you, how much memory do you want to allocate for each router that's using this software? Now, if you do too much memory, it's not going to hurt the router, but certainly going to hurt your laptop because you're going to run out of memory that much faster. You won't be able to create larger topologies. On the flip side, if you allocate too little memory to that software, well, now your routers might either not start up at all, or they might start up with a whole bunch of errors and traceback messages, or they might start up, they might run for a little while, and then you go to turn on some new feature or protocol and bang, now you start getting traceback messages and errors. So we want to make sure that we're mindful of memory in those two circumstances. How much memory this particular image is going to chew up in my laptop every time I open up a router, and how much memory does a software image take? How do I know the answer to that? So when I'm importing it into GNS3, I can select the correct amount of memory. So let's look at these to begin with. So let's say that I had available to me, let's say I had, so here I'm fortunate in that I have several versions of software available to me. So maybe I say, okay, well, let's see, how about the 7200 here? I know there's lots of different port adapters that go with 7200, so that's going to give me a lot of choices as far as what kinds of interfaces I want. Well, if I'm going to use that, first thing I'm going to have to know is how much memory is that going to consume? I don't know the answer to that off the top of my head, so I'll go back to our trusty Cisco Feature Navigator and research software. And once again, research it by platform and iOS because I know that this was a 7200 image I'm interested in. So from my platform, I'll find 7200 here in my list. Here we go, 7200. And that particular image was mainline 12.233. It's 12.233 SRE. So 12, and let me just zoom in on here in case you weren't able to see that. This is the image I'm looking up right now, the 7200 series. 12.233 SRE. All right, so let's just go down here. So 12.2, and here is SRE. And my particular one is 12.233 SRE3. So 12.233 SRE3. There we go. And the feature set I have is Advanced Enterprise K9. Here we go, Advanced Enterprise. All right, so it tells me right here, the minimum DRAM or flash. Mostly I'm concerned with DRAM because when this router is running, it's DRAM memory that's going to be used for, storing the iOS image, creating my ARC tables and routing tables and all that stuff. So you can see a single router is going to use up 512 megabytes of DRAM memory. That's a lot. So I better have a lot of memory on my laptop to be able to handle that. Well, you might be saying, well, but Keith, I don't even really know how much memory I do have on my laptop. How do I figure that out? Well, what you can do is, now I'm just doing this based on Windows. Of course, if you're using a Mac or Linux or something else, it would be different. But in Windows, if you click on your Start button, and then somewhere in there you'll find Computer or possibly My Computer, and if you right-click on that and select Properties, you'll get a box that looks like this. And in my particular case, you can see that my particular laptop has basically about 8 gigs of RAM available. So if each one of those 7200 series routers was using about 500 megs, that means just 2 routers are using 1 gig. And remember, the GNS3 application itself is going to consume some memory, and Windows is going to consume some memory just to do the operating system. So probably not going to be able to have a whole lot of routers here if I'm using the 7200 series. But let's go ahead and try it. Let's see what that looks like. So I'll go now into GNS3. I've got it open already. And this particular project here is called just Test, so that we can reference it later on, my test project. And I'll go under Edit, Preferences, and then under Dynamips, click on iOS Routers. And here is where you actually add your iOS. I'll get into this in another video in just a second. We're going to go through the whole walkthrough process about downloading the software and setting stuff up. But just as sort of like a little preview here, I'll go ahead and do New, and I'll find that iOS image where it's located. Here it is. Click Open. I'll say yes, I want to decompress it, and don't worry if I'm going a little fast for you because we're going to walk through all these steps coming up. The main reason I'm showing this to you is because I want to show you how much memory this thing uses. Now right here, default RAM. Because I've already used GNS3 several times before recording this video, and because I've used it with this image, it actually remembered how much RAM it takes. You might be saying, oh, it's smart enough to figure that out. No, it's not. When I did this the very first time, it defaulted to a RAM size of about 128 megabits, which clearly, or megabytes, which clearly would not be nearly enough. So just make sure that this number right here is the same number that you found on the Cisco Feature Navigator. Now just a little word about that as well. So in the Cisco Feature Navigator, when it gives you that number, like this image requires 512 megabytes or 256 megabytes, where they really come up with that number is they say, if you had that image running on your router and you had everything going, every possible feature and every possible protocol that this router could support, if they were all running, this is how much memory you would need. Now chances are when you're doing your GNS3 topology, you're not going to be having every single thing running that the software could potentially support. So in reality, when you're allocating your memory right here, you probably could get away with doing a little bit less than what the software actually requires. Which is kind of nice, because if you were actually loading the software on a real Cisco router, it wouldn't even load if it didn't have that amount of DRAM. But here, because we're emulating these routers, I could get away with a little bit less if I wanted to. But for the purposes of this demonstration, I'm just going to leave it to match the same number we saw in the Feature Navigator and click Next. I don't really care what I'm populating this with. For the purposes of this demonstration, that's not really relevant. So I'll just populate some slots here. Find an idle PC, and we'll talk about idle PC also coming up in a future video. This is basically a way to ensure that GNS3 and the emulated routers within it don't completely hog and use up, as it says, 100% of your CPU. Because if that happens, then your laptop will just freeze and nothing will work. So computing this idle PC gives us a number to prevent that kind of situation from happening. And in just a couple of seconds here, we should get an idle PC value for that particular software. And each software image is different. Right now I'm doing it for a 7200 series, but even if I had another 7200 series software that was a different feature set or a different version, it would come up with a different idle PC value. They're all different. Okay, finish. So now we can see the 7200 is available here for me. All right, so let's just go ahead and apply that. Okay, now let's just create a real simple project. Now, before I do anything, we can see that if I bring this up, so what GNS3 does by default is within your C drive, within your users folder, and then your name, whatever it is, you'll see a GNS3 folder and then a subfolder called projects. And you can see that test is in there. Now, right now, I have not added any routers to this project. There's really nothing running, so you can see when I just hover over it, that project, which is pretty much doing nothing right now, is using about 74.2 megabytes. All right, let's see how that number changes as I start pulling some routers into my project. So let's go ahead and open this up, and let's just pull a single 7200 series. Now, I haven't started it yet. This router is sort of like in a power down state. It's there in the image, but it's not running yet. Did that actually change anything in my project? Let's hover it over it again. Nope, still 74.2 megs. Okay, so that hasn't changed anything. So let's just go ahead and add in, let's just start with that one router. So now I'm going to go ahead and turn it on. Remember, we were at 74.2 megs before, right? Now the router's running one instance of a 7200. Now, instead of 74.2 megs, what are we up to now? Well, it still says 74.2, but I find that highly suspicious. Let's go into our projects file, Dynamips. And here we can see, okay, so we've got, here's my iOS image, and we can see it's using roughly 262 megs right now. Now this is called a ghost file. We can also see up here the input-output memory of 262 megabytes. That's one router. Let's add a second router. Let's bring a second router of the exact same type, 7200, into the mix. I'm not going to connect them or anything. I'm going to go ahead and start that guy up. Start. Okay, so let's go back. Now look at this. Now we have, if I zoom in on this a little bit, we have 262 megs for 7200 i3 and another 262 megs for 7200 i2. So you can see it's starting to consume quite a bit more memory. Each time I open up a new router and I start it, it's consuming another 262 megs within my projects folder. Now once I go back and I stop these guys, don't need them anymore, so stop them. Go back to users, and you can see now those files are gone. The only file that's left is the ghost file of 262 megs, but those other I/O memory files that were consuming a lot are gone. Now you might be thinking, okay, well, is that going to be the case with every router that I have? Well, not necessarily. For example, in this particular project, let me go ahead and get rid of these two routers. Delete, yes. Right-click, delete, yes. Now let's use a 3725, which I already imported in here. Okay, let's turn one of these on. Start. Let's go back to my projects folder. Okay, let's refresh this a little bit. Refresh. Okay, so now at this point, if I zoom in, we can see that I have a ghost file. It always creates a single ghost file that sort of represents that iOS image it's using. So whether you've got 2 routers or 5 routers or 10 routers, there's going to be one ghost file for that particular iOS. So there it is, 262 megs. And let's see here. Don't really see any I/O mem file for the 3725. I just see really, this is really the single largest file right now. Now it also has the 7200 in here. That's sort of like a carryover from when I had the 7200 in there. As a matter of fact, let's just get rid of all of that. So here's what I'm going to do to make it nice and simple. I'm going to stop the router, close up shop, quit, yep, discard, I don't want any changes. All right, let's go ahead and restart GNS3 again. I'm just trying to show you how this affects the memory of your laptop as I do these various things. Okay, let's go ahead and title it Test 2. Okay. Edit Preferences, Routers. Okay, so for Test 2, I'm going to say, oh, I don't want the 7200 at all. So let's just get rid of that image. Apply. Okay. All right, so let's bring a 3725 into the mix. Start it up. Okay, so we have one router, but this time it's a different router, a 3725 router. Now when we go into Test 2 project, there it is, and go into our project files, Dynamips, we can see with that 3725 that is currently running right now, the single largest file we have is our ghost file for that particular software image. That's it. Now remember, what did we see with the 7200 series? When I opened up a second router, well, with just one 7200, not only did we have the ghost file, we also had this really large IO mem file for the 7200 that was basically the same size. And every time I opened a second 7200 and then a third 7200, that created another IO mem file for that. But notice, no IO mem files here for this 3725. Let's go ahead and open up a second instance of that router. Let's go ahead and drag and drop it. Let's start it up. There we go. Go back to our file. And notice once again, we only have one large file, just the ghost file. We don't have those really large IO mem files that we were seeing with the 7200 series. So what's the takeaway from all this? We've talked about a lot of stuff. The takeaway from this is, number one, when you are importing your router, your software images into GNS3, some of those software images, like for the 7200 series, every time you start a new router, it takes up a gob of memory in your laptop. We saw that with the 7200 series, and I just had 2 routers in my topology. Other software images, like the 3725, you can start up 3, 4, 5, 6 instances of those routers, but you're only going to have one large ghost file representing the software. You're not going to have multiple instances of other files like these IO mem files. So that's really going to conserve memory in your laptop. And the other thing we talked about was when you're importing a software image into GNS3, one of the things it's going to ask you is, how much memory do you want to allocate for this router? As a good rule of thumb, it's a good idea to know in advance how much memory that router image needs based on the Cisco Feature Navigator. And once you have that, allocate that same amount into GNS3 for that particular platform.